welcome to another program in our series, Free Thinking Forum. I'm Bill Weir, producer and host, and I'm delighted to welcome Amanda Harrington
Thank you, Bill.
to the show. Amanda, you've got a marvelous way about, and the talk I heard just recently at my church. Would you tell us about your background that led to your capacity to?
Absolutely. I grew up in Lake Elmo, so a small town near Stillwater. Most people don't know where Lake Elmo is. And I went to Stillwater Area High School, one of the few people of color in that area. I was raised by a single white mom who had some challenges. So I consequently experienced some challenges growing up. And when I got to be an adult, I thought, I want to be that person who can help kids, who can give them a voice and advocate for them, and so decided to go into social work. And I started off by doing therapy with children, so play therapy with very young children, and went into managing a daycare briefly, and then found myself working in Minneapolis Public Schools, where I've been a social worker for the past 10 years. And I have to say that I'm not representing Minneapolis Public Schools here today. I'm just here as an individual in my personal capacity.
Mm-hmm. And tell us more about your experience as a parent.
That's right. I have a 7-year-old son who is also a student with Minneapolis Public Schools. And he is also multiracial. So as I am sending him through the school system, I'm very aware of the challenges that just the educational system brings for children of color. And I'm aware that he's perceived as a black boy, regardless that he's also Native American and also white. I've been really lucky to have a lot of supportive teachers and other school staff who have worked with him, but there have been challenges too. He got in trouble his very first day of kindergarten for, he had a behavior referral for attacking another student, when really he's just a bundle of energy on his first day of kindergarten, and he was really excited and he tackled a friend. So luckily I was able to intervene because I understand how to work in this system, but I can see how for other parents, having that experience on their child's first day of school would possibly leave a bad taste in their mouth. Since that time, he has just grown incredibly. He went into school not reading at all, and now he's been identified as an advanced learner who is reading at an 8th grade level. So that brings additional challenges of its own. Trying to keep up with a child like that is
yes,
it's a handful.
Well, you bring that experience of parenting to your work as a school social worker.
Exactly. I'm always trying to use that lens of how would I feel as a parent in this situation? What words am I hearing school professionals use that I wouldn't understand? We like to use a lot of jargon in schools. And just, you know, how would I want somebody to advocate for me if I didn't feel confident in that system or talking to a table full of professionals? So I try to play that role for them as a school social worker.
Good for you. And what are some of the current challenges that you're finding in K through 12 education?
I think a lot of people know that funding is a challenge, and that's not new. Getting enough information from the government to fund all of the special education needs, and as I said, advanced learner needs, staffing. But some of the other challenges that I encounter more typically on my day-to-day work is really related to children in special education, the over-identification of black boys specifically in special education, and then equity in general. There's a lot of talk right now about, is this educational system set up to fail students of color, quite honestly? And are there changes that need to happen? I think everybody agrees that there are changes that need to happen, but how do we make those changes come about quickly enough so that we can help the students that we've got right now?
So how are children with behavior needs supported?
It's different. It depends on the child. We really focus in public schools on differentiating for the needs of each student. So we look at each student's behavior needs. We look at their history in the educational system, at their family history, if there are any disabilities that are affecting it, and we would react accordingly. So there are some students who really just need a little bit of support, and they might be getting a once-a-week social emotional group where they're learning pro-social skills from a social worker. There are other students who need something much more intensive. They have too much anxiety to function well in a class of 25 to 30 students. So they might need a classroom that only has 12 students and 1 teacher and 2 adult assistants. So much more support in a quieter, calmer environment. It really depends on the student. That being said, there are also students who we haven't figured out exactly how to support them. And so these students do tend to get in trouble. We are suspending a lot of students still, a lot of students of color, and figuring out what will work for them, figuring out what supports we can provide consistently, and that the teachers can and are willing to provide, in addition to the other school staff, is a challenge right now.
Yes, and I've worked for a time with parents whose children have been taken out of the home and trying to help them be ready to welcome back their children.
Absolutely.
And I'm wondering whether there's adequate recognition of the challenges that parents may have with many children in the home. Children adapt to that setting, and it may not go very well in school.
Right, that's something that I feel very passionate about, and that came out in the talk that you heard recently.
Yes.
So often we tend to look at students' behavior and we call them naughty, or we say that they're violent and they're dangerous, they're behavior problems, and we stop there. We are supposed to look at the antecedents, what is causing the behavior, but we don't always have enough information, or we're just moving too fast to realize that sometimes these students are having behaviors because of trauma. And it's not always because of trauma, but there are families that we work with that have really challenging home lives, as you described. And so if you have a child who, from the time that they were a baby, had an adult who is unable or not willing to do their parent job, we call it. So when the baby cries, we would expect that child to be picked up and held or changed or fed. But instead, either the parent doesn't come, maybe there's some substance abuse or mental health issues that the parent is dealing with, or the person who does come to help the child hurts them. There's some abuse happening. Again, it could be related to significant parental substance abuse or mental health issues. It's not to lay blame, but for whatever reason, they're not able to treat the child as they need, and that child experiences that as an infant and as a toddler and as a preschooler, and eventually they learn that adults are scary, that adults can't be trusted, and that adults will hurt them. And so they adapt to that environment, and I like to say the frightened become the frightening. So they learn that it is better for them to act out, to keep adults away, versus let an adult get close enough to hurt them. And that behavior comes with them to school. And so it's really hard for school staff to necessarily keep that in mind, because the parent's not going to come to school and tell us that that's what's happening at home. And the child can't necessarily tell us, either because they're too young to have that conversation, or it's just too scary to be able to admit that the person who's supposed to be taking care of you, the person that you depend on most, is the one who's hurting you. So there's a little bit of guesswork involved, but we would treat a child who is reacting out of fear in school different than we would treat a child who is, like I said, just being naughty.
Yes, well, that's, and as you point out, this is very often hard for the teachers and social workers in school to get enough information.
Right, and that's why it's important to have a full school team. We can't just lay the blame on the teachers, because they have a huge job. They have to teach kids with a broad range of developmental levels and needs, and help them increase their test scores and just develop as children. And so we really need school psychologists and counselors and social workers. We need all of those team members who can support the student and the teacher and the family, so that we can be doing home visits like in the old days. Social workers, hundreds of years ago, the social work profession was created by a bunch of women who went out into people's homes to find out what they needed to be successful. And so we're returning to that. There are social workers and teachers who will go out into the homes and meet the parents where they're at. They get to see the living environment that the child is living in. They get to experience the home life. If there are a number of people living on mattresses on the floor, if the family has no furniture because they just moved in and they could afford the apartment but not any furniture. Or sometimes we have quite a few families actually who are homeless and highly mobile. And so they don't have a place that's their own at all. Maybe they're staying in a shelter where they have no privacy. They're with a number of different families. There's all of these challenges that the social worker can learn and bring back to the school to give the rest of the team that perspective and that empathy.
Yes. Well, I think we both recognize there's a lack of sufficient affordable housing.
Absolutely.
And the mayor of Minneapolis is putting a very strong emphasis on that as goals of his administration is to provide that affordable housing.
And that'll be really helpful because we've seen the statistics that show that children are the biggest population of our homeless Minnesotans. And that's surprising to people because that's not who they see necessarily on a street corner, or that's not who they think of as populating the shelters. But these families are moving from couch to couch, or they're sleeping in their car. And yet a lot of these families are still getting their children to school every day. And then the student is maybe able to keep it together while they're in the shelter. They don't want to be a problem for their parent. They know they can't make waves. So when they come to school, that's a safe place for them to let some of these feelings and behaviors out.
So what training do teachers and school staff receive regarding children's mental health needs?
We've had quite a bit of training regarding trauma recently, and then all teachers, all licensed school staff, which includes speech clinicians, occupational therapists, have to have training every 5 years regarding early warning signs of mental health. And there's a new requirement that's just been instituted by the Department of Education so that everyone has to get training on suicide prevention. That being said, not all of these behaviors are related to mental health.
No.
So trauma in and of itself is not a mental health disorder. So trauma does not always lead to depression or to oppositional defiant disorder. It can, but it's one of the challenges that we're piecing out is, does the student truly have a disability? Has it gotten to the point where they have a mental health disorder or learning disability? Or is it just trauma where if we have some early remediation, that could be fixed? And they wouldn't need to be long-term in special education or other services.
And yet, I think that many of the students of color are seen as having a mental health problem, when in fact that's not the basis for it.
That's true. And it's actually, there's an important distinction. What children get in schools is an educational disability label, which is different from having a mental health diagnosis.
Yeah.
And often people see them as interchangeable. The schools can take the mental health diagnosis as information that can inform an educational label, but they're not the same thing. So often in schools, we will have students, and often black boys, who get the label of EBD, or emotional behavior disorder. They may also have a label from a psychiatrist or a psychologist of oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, ADHD sometimes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have EBD. That being said, these kids are getting this label because they have challenging behaviors in school. It's affecting their learning, and so staff want to support them. And I think that they feel at a loss for how else to do that besides giving them that label and putting them into special education. Because of the lack of other resources, they feel that there's no other way that the student can get their needs met without putting them in special education. And I see that changing. There are certainly people high up in school systems who are trying to change that. They're pushing back on teams who are saying this student must be EBD. And they're saying, what else could it be caused by? What else can we try as an intervention before we get to that point of labeling? But it's a slow change.
So some of these problems arising from racial diagnosis, really, mistaken diagnosis, are being addressed, but are there other facets of racial disparities being addressed in schools?
Schools have a big push right now for equity training. So there are trainings, there are teams within schools to try and figure out how to make the school itself more equitable. It depends, though, on who's on the team. Mm-hmm. Who's leading the team, who are the members of the team, the teachers in the school, if they're open to that. I really feel like the trainings help. The mental health training helps, the equity training helps, all of these things help, but what we need is a philosophical change on the part not just of administrators, but of teachers, everybody in the educational system. We need to look at kids differently.
So how would you suggest, what is the basic, the core of that philosophical change?
That's a hard question.
Yes.
I think we need to have empathy for the individual child and their story. We need to admire the behaviors, which seems counterintuitive. But if you take a child with behavior problems, we need to admire that those behavior problems are a result of them adapting to their home environment, potentially. And that's amazing that they are able to do that nobody had to tell them this is how you adapt to survive in your family. They just did that. So if we can stop and admire that, then we would know how to proceed to help give them positive behaviors to use in an educational setting where they don't need the old behaviors to stay safe.
Good. Yeah, that sounds like a better way.
But it's going to involve not just a training for teachers that are already there, it's going to involve changing teacher training way back at the college level before teachers even get into the schools.
And what kind of changes would you recommend?
Again, it's a completely philosophical change, so I think the way that we talk about kids needs to change. There's a lot of talk about counter narratives. So you hear words like that angry parent. Are they angry or are they righteously rageful because of the experience that they've had in their life of being failed by a school system or by a society who has discriminated against them? Mm-hmm. Or I was at a training recently from the Wilder Foundation, and that's where they came up with, where they shared this idea of counter narratives. They talk about a student who doesn't speak very good English. Maybe they speak slang a lot of times. Well, are they speaking slang, or is it that they're bilingual? They've learned how to operate and talk within a school system where we use really proper English language, but they've also learned how to talk and survive on the streets near their home, where people talk differently. So again, it's just a way of admiring versus pathologizing these behaviors that we're seeing all the time. We have to change the way that we think about students, we have to change the way that we talk about students, and we have to do that over and over and over again. It's not necessarily that there's a curriculum that will fix that. We just have to change core beliefs, and that's so much harder because people have to be willing to change their core beliefs.
There still is racial discrimination.
There absolutely is.
And how can we help more school people get over that?
There's not a blanket answer because everybody's on a different place in their journey about understanding race and culture. Some people have studied and thought about their beliefs and their role in that system for many years, and for some people this is a new topic. So it's hard to come up with a blanket program that works for everybody, but I think we're getting there by having the conversation.
Good.
And that's a good start, but it has to continue. There has to be time and space for it to continue, which is a challenge in the schools because of how much pressure there is to raise test scores, to fit certain blocks of curriculum into a certain part of the school day. Teachers feel like they're pulled in so many different directions because they have to have 2 hours of literacy and this much of math, and there's not even enough time for play or for recess anymore. So sometimes for teachers it feels like this equity thing, this racial equity thing is too much. They can't fit one more thing into their day, but it's not an additional thing, it's just something that needs to be integrated in everything that we do, in how we welcome a student to our class, in how we repair if there's been a disagreement between a student and a staff person. And some of that is teachers having to deal with their own mental health, their own issues outside of school, so that they can be fully present and able to deal with the child's issues. And when I say teachers, I'm not just talking about teachers who teach a classroom, I'm really talking about all staff within a school, because we all have a part to play in this.
Now, we have about 6 minutes left. I'd like to know a little more about the history of school social work and how it connects with the challenges today.
Social work has a very long history. I think I said about 100 years ago, women mostly started going into people's homes. But social work has really branched out from that time. We have entered schools. Social workers didn't used to be in schools. Even when I was in school, 20-some years ago, there weren't social workers in the schools. Social workers have become more entrenched in hospitals and mental health systems, so they've branched out a lot of places, but at the core, social work is always about understanding the whole person. So a person is not just the mental illness or their label, but they are their lived experiences, they are everything that occurs with their body and their mind and their family and their neighborhood. So we take all of that into consideration and we bring that information to the team. So that being said, we haven't always done the best job. We have sometimes as social workers been involved in making some poor decisions, like pulling students out of their home to go to boarding schools in the cases of Native American students. We have been part of this educational system that is still broken and doesn't work for all students of color. And I feel like, just like teachers, that is changing as we question our role and try to get back to our roots about justice and considering the whole person.
So you see some progress?
I do see some progress. It's slow, and I think that's been true for many changes in our country, but it is happening. There are more discussions, there are more explicit discussions than ever before. We're asking people to sit down in groups in their schools. We're asking them to sit down with their peers. There are many social work groups where I work that are really just talking 2 hours every month. They get together with other social workers and they talk about race and they wrestle with this with each other. What's my part in this? What can I call out? Is it safe to call out team members? What's the risk of not calling out team members? We're really wrestling with these issues explicitly now, more than ever before.
Good. That sounds promising. And you talked about some things that could make a difference. Are there other things that you see that could make a positive difference?
I think we need more involvement from the community, and I'm not sure exactly what that looks like, but schools in and of themselves aren't going to be able to change quick enough to become this equitable system that we want them to be. I think if that were the case, they would have changed already and things would have been fixed. So we're going to need the help of parents and community organizations and lawmakers, and I think everybody needs to come together to reimagine what education can look like. It's going to be something different than what we have right now, which will make some people uncomfortable. And I'm not one of the visionaries that can tell you exactly what that will look like, but I will be on the front lines doing the work when we figure that out.
Are there any authors of books on this subject that might be helpful for people to look into, to understand the situation?
Well, A Good Time for the Truth, and I can't remember the author off the top of my head, has been a book that we've used a lot in our work right now with social workers, because it's stories from a diverse group of Minnesotans about their experiences growing up in Minnesota. So it gives us perspective of people of different ages and different races going through school or being parents. It's not just focused on education, it's focused on all aspects of life, but it's given us some really good insight and some concrete narratives that we can struggle with versus talking about theoretical ideas of equity. We can actually talk about somebody's lived experience and try to apply that to what our children, our students are living today. So that's been a really useful
Good.
tool.
I've been at sessions that are focused on that particular book,
Mm-hmm.
and it's published by, I forget, is it a Minnesota state agency? Do you recall?
I can't remember off the top of my
But
head.
the name again is
A Good Time for the Truth.
a good time for
The truth.
the truth.
Yep.
Good. So we're down to less than a minute,
Oh,
and I am delighted to be able to bring you and your wisdom to the people who are tuned in.
thank you so much.
Thank you.